think about your weekend. Think about clocking out at the end of a really long, exhausting workday.
Oh, that feeling of just being entirely drained.
Right. I want you to genuinely put yourself in that headspace for a second. You've just worked a 52-hour week.
Which is just brutal.
Totally brutal. Your body aches from sitting hunched over a violently vibrating machine. You're breathing in the stale air that's just thick with cotton dust.
Yeah, you can practically feel it in your lungs.
Exactly. And you're making absolute pennies for your labor. So it's late Saturday afternoon, the sun is starting to dip, and you are eagerly waiting to just grab your coat, go home, rest your hands, and finally see your family.
You're just watching the clock at that point.
You are, and you finally get the signal to leave, so you walk over to the heavy door leading to the stairwell, you turn the knob, and you find that it has been intentionally locked from the outside.
It's just a terrifying thought.
You are trapped. Okay, let's unpack this, because to truly grasp the sheer suffocating horror of the scenario, we have to let's transition from our modern comforts and step directly into the gritty, highly combustible reality of Greenwich Village in 1911.
Yeah, we really have to set the scene.
We do. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a comprehensive historical overview of the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City.
It is a really heavy topic, obviously.
It is, yeah. But our mission today is to explore how a horrifying, entirely preventable tragedy fundamentally transformed American labor laws, fueled the massive growth of labor unions, and why modern memorial efforts are fighting so hard to keep the memory of these specific immigrant workers alive right now.
Right, because it's not just some abstract historical event.
Yeah.
It's an absolute cornerstone of American social history.
Definitely.
To understand the modern workplace like, why we have the specific safety standards we do, why the labor movement shifted from a fringe concept to a massive political force. You really have to understand the mechanics of what happened on that Saturday afternoon in March of 1911.
So let's start with the location itself.
Right, so we were looking at the Ash Building. It was later renamed the Brown Building, and it actually still stands today in Manhattan.
Wait, it's still there?
Yeah, it's right on the northwest corner of Green Street and Washington Place, which is just a block east of Washington Square Park. Today, it's actually part of the New York University campus.
Oh, wow. I bet half the students don't even know.
Probably not, though it is a national historic landmark. But back in 1911, the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of this 10-story building were occupied by the Triangle Waist Company.
And they were churning out shirtwaists, which, if you don't know, those are those high-collared, puffy-sleeved blouses that were basically the absolute uniform of the modern working woman at the time.
Exactly. If you look at any photograph of a Gibson girl from that era, she's wearing a shirtwaist.
Right. So the factory was owned by two men, Max Blank and Isaac Harris. And they were themselves Jewish immigrants who had kind of climbed the ladder of the garment industry, right?
Yeah, they became known around the city as the Shirtwaist Kings.
The Shirtwaist Kings, wow. And they normally employed about 500 workers in this massive open floor space. But before we get to the disaster itself, we really need to look at the human element. Like, who were the people sitting at those long tables?
Yeah, shoulder to shoulder, listening to the deafening roar of hundreds of sewing machines.
Exactly. Who were they?
Well, the vast majority of those 500 workers were young, recent Italian and Jewish immigrant women and girls.
And when you say young, I mean, how young are we talking?
We mean the ages primarily range from 14 to 23 years old.
14, that's 8th grade.
Yeah. I mean, these were individuals who often came from deep poverty. They were arriving from the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe or the impoverished regions of southern Italy.
And they were living in those densely packed, poorly ventilated tenements of the Lower East Side.
Exactly. Most of them had little to no formal education, and they possess a very poor command of the English language.
Which makes them incredibly vulnerable.
Oh, completely. They were navigating a brand new country, a massive, overwhelming city, and a brutal industrial economy all at the exact same time.
The economics of their situation are just staggering when you really lay them out. I mean, they were working 9 hours a day on weekdays, plus an additional 7 hours on Saturdays.
Which adds up fast.
It does. That's 52 hours of grueling, repetitive physical labor every single week. And the compensation for that was between $7 and $12 a week.
Yeah, which doesn't sound like much, and it wasn't.
No. Even if we adjust that to modern currency, it's roughly the equivalent of maybe $240 to $400 a week. So we are talking about $5 to $8 an hour in today's money.
It's essentially starvation wages.
Yeah.
But there is a deeper mechanical aspect to how they were paid, too. It wasn't just a simple hourly wage.
Right, right. Can you explain that? Because the subcontracting thing is wild.
Yeah. So the garment industry operated heavily on a piece rate system, or basically a subcontracting system within the factory walls. Blank and Harris would pay a male contractor, who was known as a sweater, a set amount for a batch of garments.
Okay.
And then that sweater would hire these young women to do the actual sewing, and he paid them out of his own cut.
So his profit entirely depends on squeezing them.
Exactly. The sweater's profit margin depended entirely on driving these girls to work as fast as humanly possible while paying them as little as possible.
And the deductions, too. The sources mentioned they were actually charged for their own supplies.
Oh, it was awful. They had their pay docked for the needles they broke, the thread they used, even the electric power that ran their sewing machines.
Wait, they had to pay for the electricity to run the boss's machines?
They absolutely did. They were squeezed from every conceivable angle.
Which really makes me think about the modern fast fashion supply chain, you know? But we need to look closer at the mechanism of that exploitation here. Today, brands use shell companies and oversized contractors specifically to create, like, a legal firewall between themselves and sweatshop conditions.
Right. Distance and plausible deniability are the economic incentives.
Exactly. But Blank and Harris were doing the exact same thing, just geographically closer. I mean, they hired people who couldn't speak English because a language barrier is a built-in firewall against complaints.
That's a great point.
If your workers don't speak the language of the police or the building inspectors or the newspapers, they are inherently isolated.
And that isolation was a calculated business decision. Management heavily preferred hiring these young immigrant women over men because they were cheaper. But crucially, they were perceived as much less likely to unionize.
They just wanted a docile workforce.
Exactly. They were viewed as compliant and easily intimidated. I mean, if a 14-year-old girl who speaks only Yiddish or Sicilian complains about the piece rate or the locked doors, you can simply fire her.
And there's 1,000 more stepping off the boats at Ellis Island to take her place.
Right. The sources strongly point to a system built entirely on extraction. When you intentionally hire the most vulnerable, easily silenced demographic you can find, you are prioritizing margin over humanity.
But wait, just to play devil's advocate here for a second, were Blank and Harris uniquely evil? Or were they just operating a standard business in 1911? Like, if they viewed these women as disposable cogs, wasn't that just the prevailing industrial mindset of the era?
Well, it was certainly the prevailing mindset, yes.
Yeah.
But the Triangle Factory was notorious, even among its peers, for its strictness and its intense anti-union paranoia.
So they were bad even for 1911.
Yes. And this dehumanization of the workforce didn't just create a miserable daily existence, it set the literal and physical stage for the disaster. Because when you devalue human life in your underlying business model, you are certainly not going to invest capital in protecting that life. You're not going to spend money on extra exits or fire drills or better ventilation because the people inside are seen as easily replaceable inventory, not human beings.
Wow. That just sets up the perfect, horrific storm for March 25, 1911.
It really does.
So let's get into that day. It's a Saturday. It is approximately 4:4 in the afternoon. The workday is just minutes away from ending.
The workers are likely thinking about gathering their coats, getting their meager paychecks, and heading back to the tenements.
And then the spark.
Right. At the northeast corner of the 8th floor, tucked under one of the cutter's tables, a fire flares up in a scrap bin.
And do we know how it started?
The fire marshal later concluded that the most likely cause was an unextinguished match or a cigarette butt tossed into this wooden bin. Now, you have to picture what was in this bin and what was in the room. This wasn't a modern office trash can.
Right.
This bin contained 2 months' worth of accumulated fabric cuttings.
Wait, 2 months? Why would they let hundreds of pounds of highly flammable scraps just pile up under the tables for 2 months?
Because the scraps had value. The owners sold the scraps to a ragman who would come and collect them by the ton to be recycled into shoddy or cheap felt.
Okay, so it was a side hustle for the owners.
Exactly. But the ragman hadn't been there in over 8 weeks. So you have hundreds of pounds of leftover sheer cotton and lawn fabric piled up.
And somebody was smoking near. I thought smoking was banned.
It was technically banned in the factory, for obvious reasons, but it was an open secret that the male cutters, who had slightly more status in the factory hierarchy, would sneak cigarettes. They would exhale the smoke downward through their lapels to avoid being caught by the floor managers. So a discarded cigarette meets a mountain of bone-dry fabric.
And the physical environment of that room, it is hard to overstate how primed it was for a flash fire.
The physics of the space were deadly. It wasn't just the scraps in the bin. Above the tables, lines of finished and unfinished delicate cotton shirtwaists were hung from wires strung across the ceiling.
Oh, so the fire can literally travel across the ceiling.
Right, they acted almost like a canopy of kindling. Plus, the wooden tables were soaked in lubricating oil that constantly dripped from the hundreds of sewing machines. The floorboards were saturated with years of this machine oil.
That sounds like a bomb waiting to go off.
It was. And perhaps most dangerous of all, the air itself was thick with suspended cotton dust and lint, which can act almost like an explosive accelerant when exposed to an open flame. The environment was a literal tinderbox.
What's terrifying is the speed at which this environment turned against them. The communication breakdown was just instantaneous and catastrophic.
Yeah, the warnings failed almost immediately.
Right. I mean, the first fire alarm wasn't even sent from inside the Ash building. It was pulled at 4:45 p.m. by a random passerby out on Washington Place who happened to look up and see smoke billowing from the 8th floor windows.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. Inside, a bookkeeper on the 8th floor managed to use a telephone to warn the executive offices up on the 10th floor. But there was no audible alarm system in the building. There was no internal public address system.
No bells, nothing.
Nothing. There was no way to ring the 9th floor.
And imagine the claustrophobia and the suddenness of that realization. You are sandwiched on the 9th floor, surrounded by the deafening noise of 250 sewing machines running at full tilt.
You wouldn't be able to hear a thing.
Not a thing. According to survivor Yetta Lubitz, the very first warning they had of the fire on the 9th floor was the arrival of the fire itself.
That gives me chills.
Yeah, the flames just burst up through the windows from the floor below, drafting up the exterior of the building and catching the fabric hanging from the 9th floor ceiling. It bypassed any warning and simply exploded into their reality.
And this is where we really have to look at the architecture of the Ash building, because the safety protocols, or really the complete lack of them, instantly turned this from an emergency into a massacre. First of all, there were no sprinklers in the building. None.
Right. And to address your earlier point about building codes, the Ash building was considered a modern, quote-unquote, fireproof building.
Fireproof? How?
Well, technically, the structure itself was fireproof. The steel frame, the stone facade, the concrete floors, they didn't burn. But the contents of the building were a furnace. The architects and the city codes focused on ensuring the building wouldn't collapse and destroy neighboring property.
They cared about the real estate, not the people.
Exactly. They gave almost zero thought to the people trapped inside the fireproof box.
That is a chilling distinction. The building survives, but everyone inside cooks. So let's look at the exit options for these girls. The 9th floor had a few potential routes: 2 freight elevators, a single exterior fire escape, and 2 narrow stairways leading down to Green Street and Washington Place.
But within 3 minutes, just 3 minutes of the fire reaching the 9th floor, the Green Street stairway became a wall of fire.
3 minutes? That's no time at all.
None. The stairwell acted like a chimney, drawing the superheated air, smoke, and flames violently upward. It was completely impassable in both directions.
What's fascinating here, in the most macabre sense, is the brutal irony of the factory floor's design. The sources note that the only thing in that entire open room that wasn't highly flammable was the steel trim.
Right, just the trim.
Everything else, the wicker baskets blocking the narrow aisles, the wooden tables, the cotton garments, the oil-soaked floors, was pure fuel. So when the workers realized they couldn't go down the Green Street stairs, mass panic naturally set in. Dozens of terrified women crowded onto the single exterior fire escape.
And this fire escape was an architectural illusion. It was a disaster waiting to happen.
Why? What was wrong with it?
Well, city officials had previously granted a variance to the building owners, allowing them to erect this flimsy, narrow, poorly anchored iron structure on the back of the building instead of requiring a proper fire-rated third internal staircase.
So they took the cheap way out.
Absolutely. It was essentially a cosmetic addition to appease the bare minimum of the law. It was likely already rusted and structurally compromised before the fire even started. Furthermore, it didn't even lead directly to the ground.
Wait, it didn't go to the street?
No, it ended at a skylight over a basement courtyard.
Oh my God. So you have dozens of people desperate to escape the intense blistering heat of the ninth floor piling onto this narrow iron lattice.
Yeah. And the combination of the sheer weight of the crowd and the extreme thermal stress from the flames blasting out of the windows caused the iron to warp, twist, and pull away from the
The
masonry.
addictive way.
The entire structure completely collapsed. It spilled approximately 20 victims, nearly 100 feet down, crashing through the glass skylight to the concrete pavement below. In an instant, that entire escape route was simply gone.
Okay, so let's map this out for the listener. The Green Street stairs are burning. The fire escape has just detached from the building. The elevators are making trips, and we will definitely get to the incredible heroism of those operators in a minute. But hundreds of workers are rushing in a crush of bodies toward the door for the Washington Place stairway.
The last real option.
Right. And this is the detail that is burned into the memory of this event. This is the detail that changes history. The door is locked.
It was heavily bolted, and we have to examine the mechanics of why it was locked, because it speaks directly to that economic paranoia we discussed earlier.
Right, the piece rate system and all that.
Yes. Management intentionally locked the Washington Place doors during working hours to force all employees to exit through the single Green Street door at the end of their shift.
And why did they want a bottleneck like that?
Because at that single exit, a foreman stood by to inspect every single woman's purse and physically pat them down. They wanted to ensure no one was stealing scraps of fabric, or a spool of thread, or a finished shirtwaist.
They locked human beings in a room to protect scraps of cloth. It is the ultimate manifestation of valuing property over life.
It was also a tactic of control. Historians point out that locking the secondary doors allowed the owners to tightly control who came in and out. It kept union organizers from slipping into the factory floor to distribute literature or talk to the workers.
Oh, so it was anti-union too.
Very much so. The owners were terrified of their workforce organizing. They were so paranoid about inventory shrinkage and unionization that they literally locked their employees inside a 10th-story firebox.
I just want you, listening right now, to pause and try to imagine the sensory overload and the sheer terror on that ninth floor. You are a 16-year-old girl. You're being crushed against a heavy wooden door by dozens of your coworkers. The air is thick, choking black smoke. You can't breathe. Your eyes are burning.
The heat must have been unimaginable.
Yes. And the roar of the fire is deafening. You just watch the fire escape tear away from the wall, and the heavy door to the stairs will not budge.
Because the foreman, who held the key on his belt, had already panicked and escaped by another route.
Exactly. You are trapped. How could a building in the middle of New York City be so wildly unprepared for an emergency? Especially when fires were relatively common in the garment industry.
Well, it comes down to a deeply cynical economic concept called moral hazard.
Moral hazard. What does that mean in this context?
A leading industry journal at the time, the Insurance Monitor, had actually published an observation that shirtwaists had recently started to fall out of fashion. The trend was shifting.
Okay, so demand was dropping.
Right. The journal noted that insurance for such stock was saturated with moral hazard. In the garment industry, there was a well-known dark pattern of mysterious, catastrophic fires conveniently breaking out whenever a manufacturer had excess, out-of-style inventory.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, the fire allowed the owners to liquidate their unsellable stock by collecting the insurance money.
That is incredible. So the insurance companies knew this was a systemic issue, and the sources explicitly mention that Blank and Harris were known to have had 4 previous suspicious fire claims at their various facilities.
4 of them, yes.
Now, to be perfectly clear, investigations concluded that arson was not suspected in this specific 1911 fire. It was deemed an accident caused by that cigarette. But the point is the precedent. They were entirely accustomed to factory fires and perhaps accustomed to benefiting financially from them.
Exactly. When your previous fires have resulted in lucrative insurance payouts, you have zero financial incentive to invest capital into preventative measures. You don't buy sprinklers or install expensive alarm systems if a fire is viewed as a potential financial safety net.
Right. Why spend money to prevent something you might want to happen?
Exactly. But this time, the fire didn't just consume out-of-season blouses. The structural failures, the locked doors, the intense heat, it forced the workers into an impossible, unthinkable choice. The temperature on the 9th floor was becoming unsurvivable.
And this is the moment the horror breaks out of the confines of the Ash building and falls directly into the public eye.
It does, in the most tragic way possible.
The fire department actually arrived incredibly quickly. The first alarms were sounded around 4:45 p.m., and horse-drawn fire engines were clattering into Washington Place within minutes. But when they got there, the technological limitations of the era became brutally apparent.
They raised their tallest ladders, fully extended.
Yeah.
The ladders only reached as high as the 6th, maybe the 7th floor. The women were trapped on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors,
So they were just out of reach.
30 feet short. The firemen were physically helpless to reach them from the outside. But inside, amidst the smoke and the stampede, there were incredible acts of bravery that we absolutely must highlight.
Yes, the elevator operators.
Right. We have to talk about Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortiaro. These men were operating the passenger elevators on the Washington Place side of the building. When the fire broke out, they didn't flee the building.
They went up into it.
They deliberately traveled upward, plunging their cars into the dense smoke, making 3 distinct trips up to the 9th floor to pull terrified passengers down to safety.
They saved dozens of lives. They were opening the elevator doors into a wall of flame, pulling girls into the car until it was overflowing, dropping down to the street and going right back up.
But the mechanics of the elevators eventually failed under the extreme conditions. The heat in the shafts became so incredibly intense that the metal guide rails of Mortiaro's elevator actually began to expand and buckle.
The metal was warping from the heat.
Yes. Furthermore, desperate victims on the 9th floor who couldn't squeeze into the crowded cars began to pry the elevator doors open by force.
Because they knew the elevator shaft was a vertical drop to the bottom, and the room behind them was an inferno.
Exactly. They peered into the empty shaft, hoping to somehow grab the greasy cables and slide down, or hoping to land on the roof of the car as it descended.
Just sheer desperation.
Dozens of workers jumped blindly into the dark shafts. The sheer weight and the kinetic impact of the falling bodies crashing onto the roof of Zito's elevator car warped the metal roof inward. It jammed the mechanism and made it impossible for him to make a fourth attempt.
So the elevators were dead.
They were dead.
With the Washington Place stairs locked, the Green Street stairs, a chimney of fire, the fire escape destroyed, the elevators disabled, and the firemen's ladders stopping 30 feet below them, the workers crowded at the 9th floor windows realized with absolute certainty that no help was coming.
Yeah.
The flames were pressing against their backs, the clothing and hair were catching fire. They began to step out onto the ledges, and they began to jump.
62 people jumped or fell to their deaths from those windows.
62.
And we have accounts from people on the ground. The reporter William Gunn Shepard, working for the United Press, happened to be walking through Washington Square Park and heard the fire engines.
He just happened to be there.
Yeah, he ran to the scene and found himself standing on the sidewalk witnessing this unimaginable horror. He later wrote a dispatch that was syndicated across the country, and he included a quote that is just hauntingly visceral.
What did he say?
He wrote, "I learned a new sound that day, a sound more horrible than description can picture, the thud of a speeding living body on a stone sidewalk."
Wow. It is so crucial to understand that this wasn't a hidden tragedy. It wasn't an explosion deep in a coal mine in a remote Appalachian town,
Right.
It was a massive, highly visible public trauma. It occurred in broad daylight on a Saturday afternoon right in the middle of a bustling Manhattan neighborhood. A massive crowd of thousands of people gathered behind police cordons, helplessly, agonizingly watching.
Lewis Waldman, a man who later became a New York Socialist state assemblyman, was reading in the Astor Library nearby and ran out when he heard the commotion.
And what did you see?
He described looking up at the 8th, 9th, and 10th stories and seeing an enormous roaring cornice of flames. Waldman's eyewitness account captures the pure psychological devastation of the event. He said the crowd stood frozen as they watched girl after girl appear at the reddened windows, pause for a terrified moment, and then leap to the pavement below to land as mangled, bloody pulp.
That is just horrifying to even picture.
He described the horrific sight of girls who hesitated too long on the sills, their dresses catching fire, and plunging to the street like living torches.
But the firemen, they had those nets, right? The life nets.
They did try frantically to deploy life nets. These were heavy canvas nets stretched tight by dozens of firemen and civilian volunteers designed to catch people jumping from burning buildings.
That didn't work.
Again, the physics of the situation overwhelmed the equipment. The life nets were designed for jumps from a 3rd or 4th story.
And this was the 9th floor.
Right. When multiple bodies, falling from 100 feet in the air, hit those nets at terminal velocity, The kinetic energy was too immense. The nets simply ripped apart, or the firemen holding them were violently thrown to the ground, breaking their arms and shoulders. The impact drove the victims straight through the canvas and onto the concrete.
Waldman noted the profound psychological weight on the bystanders. He said the emotions rolling through the crowd were indescribable. Women were shrieking hysterically, scores of people fainted right there on the street, and grown men openly wept, hurling themselves against the police lines in sheer frenzy, desperate to do something, anything, to stop the slaughter.
The entire city was collectively scarred in a matter of 30 minutes.
By the time the fire department finally managed to push streams of water into the building and extinguish the flames, the death toll was staggering. 146 people died, 123 women and girls, and 23 men.
And then the aftermath of dealing with the bodies. Yeah. It's just as grim.
Right. The bodies, those on the sidewalk, those pulled from the elevator shafts, and the charred remains recovered from the factory floor were loaded onto police wagons and taken to Charities Pier, a covered dock located at 26th Street and the East River.
And that pier grimly became known in the press as Misery Lane.
Misery Lane.
Yes. For days, friends, relatives, and frantic parents had to walk through this makeshift, cavernous morgue. The bodies were laid out in rough pine coffins. The families had to move down the line, examining jewelry, scraps of unburned fabric, or the shape of a shoe, trying to identify the burned and broken remains of their daughters and sisters.
The details of the victims really drive home the scale of the loss. The youngest victims were just 14 years old, Kate Leone and Rosaria Maltese. The oldest was a 43-year-old woman named Providenza Pano.
And the coroner determined that most died from severe burns, asphyxiation from the toxic smoke, massive blunt impact injuries from the fall, or a terrible combination of all three.
And to connect this historical event directly to our present day, it's worth highlighting the forensic difficulties of 1911. 6 of the victims were so badly burned that they were completely unrecognizable. No one came forward with matching descriptions of jewelry or clothing.
They remained listed as unknown for a full century.
100 years. It wasn't until 2011, leading up to the centennial anniversary, that an independent historian named Michael Hirsch made it his mission to find them.
That is an incredible piece of historical detective work.
It is. How did he even do it?
It took 4 years of meticulous, obsessive research. He cross-referenced thousands of pages of obscure census data, missing persons reports filed in the days after the fire, marriage certificates, and old church records. He managed to track down the surviving descendants and definitively identify those final 6 victims by name.
They were finally given their names back. Josephine Camerata, Constantina Peluso, Fanny Rosen, Dora Evans, Maria Giuseppa Loletti, and Max Florin.
It's beautiful that he did that.
It really is. They are buried together beneath a large monument featuring a kneeling, weeping woman in the cemetery at the Evergreens in Brooklyn. The Hebrew Free Burial Association also buried 22 of the Jewish victims in a special dedicated section at Mount Richmond Cemetery in Staten Island.
The impact on the working-class community was just immeasurable. The grief was a physical weight on the city.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because this is where the narrative moves from tragedy to infuriating injustice. You have 146 dead bodies on the pavement and in the morgue. A tragedy of this magnitude, caused by such blatant negligence, demands justice. You would naturally assume that society would demand immediate severe punishment for the owners.
That is the logical human assumption. If a factory owner locks the doors and 146 people burn to death, someone must go to prison. But the reality of the American legal system in 1911 shatters that assumption entirely. The tragedy was vastly compounded by a court system that was fundamentally designed to protect property, capital, and the wealthy, while placing almost impossible burdens on immigrant laborers seeking restitution.
So let's talk about the owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris. Where were they during the fire? When the spark hit the scrap bin, they were actually in the building, up in their executive offices on the 10th floor.
They had even invited their children to the factory that afternoon.
Wow. But when the smoke rose through the stairwells, they didn't go down to the 9th floor to unlock the doors or help organize an evacuation. They, along with their families and the 10th floor office staff, fled upward to the roof of the building.
And they managed to climb across to an adjoining building and survived without a scratch.
Unbelievable. So in mid-April, following a massive public outcry and a grand jury investigation, Blank and Harris were indicted on charges of first and second-degree manslaughter.
The trial began in December of 1911 in a packed Manhattan courtroom. The owners had vast financial resources, and they used them to hire one of the most prominent, expensive defense lawyers in New York, a man named Max Steuer.
And Steuer's strategy was brilliant in a deeply ruthless, cynical way, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He knew he couldn't argue that the fire didn't happen or that the conditions weren't dangerous. He focused entirely on dismantling the prosecution's specific legal burden. The prosecution's entire case rested heavily on proving that the owners were personally, criminally responsible for the locked door on the Washington Place stairway.
Well, they brought in survivors to testify, right?
Yes, a young survivor named Kate Alterman was a key witness for the prosecution. She had been on the 9th floor, she had tried the Washington Place door, and she testified under oath that it was locked.
Wait, if an eyewitness testifies the door was locked, shouldn't that be an open and shut case? How did Steuer counter that?
He essentially weaponized the trauma and the language barrier against her. Steuer cross-examined Alterman for hours. He didn't yell at her. Instead, he politely, persistently asked her to repeat her account of the fire over and over again from the beginning.
What was the point of that?
Well, Kate Alterman was an immigrant. English was not her first language. She was testifying in a terrifying, formal courtroom setting against the wealthy men who used to employ her. Because she was deeply traumatized and likely wanted to ensure she delivered her story accurately without stumbling over the English translations, she had mentally rehearsed her account.
Ooh, like memorizing a script to make sure you don't mess up the facts when you're nervous.
Exactly. So every time Steuer asked her to recount the timeline, she used the exact same key phrases, the same descriptive adjectives in the same order.
And he used that against her.
He dramatically turned to the jury. He didn't argue that she was lying about the fire. He argued that because she used the exact same phrasing every time, her testimony was nothing more than rote memorization.
That is just sickening.
He suggested to the jury that she had been aggressively coached by the overzealous prosecutors, and therefore her memory of the locked door couldn't be trusted. He entirely discredited her as an independent, reliable witness in the eyes of the jury.
He used her vulnerability and her attempt to be precise as proof of perjury. But even with her testimony weakened, physical evidence showed the locks were engaged. The door frames were burned, but the heavy deadbolts were found extended. How could a jury acquit these men?
If we look closely at the legal mechanics of the era, it comes down to the judge's instructions regarding the strict burden of proof. The investigation absolutely proved that the locks existed and that management's policy was to keep them locked during working hours.
Okay.
However, the judge explicitly instructed the jury that to convict Blank and Harris of manslaughter, the prosecution had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the owners personally knew that specific door was locked at the exact moment the fire broke out.
Which is an impossible standard. Unless the prosecution could produce a witness who testified, I walked up to the 10th floor at 4:35 p.m. and specifically told Mr. Blank the 9th floor door is currently locked. They couldn't prove real-time knowledge.
Exactly. Steuer stressed that the foreman might have locked it without their immediate knowledge, or that someone else turned the key. Because the prosecution failed to prove that specific microscopic level of real-time knowledge, the jury felt they had no choice under the law.
Wow.
After less than 2 hours of deliberation, they acquitted both men of manslaughter.
They walked free. 146 people were dead, the city was in mourning, and the owners walked out of the courtroom through a side door to avoid the angry mob outside.
It's hard to stomach.
It really is.
Yeah.
The families of the victims eventually sued them in a civil court in 1913, and there, with a lower burden of proof, Blank and Harris were found liable for wrongful death. But the compensation awarded by the court to the grieving families was a measly $75 per deceased victim.
And here is the ultimate sickening insult that perfectly encapsulates the unregulated capitalism of the Gilded Age. When you look at the insurance mathematics, Blank and Harris had heavily, aggressively insured their factory and their inventory against fire damage.
Of course they did.
The insurance companies paid them out in full. When the dust settled, the owners received $64,925 more than their reported property losses.
Wait, they made money?
Yes. When you divide that massive surplus out, the owners essentially received about $445 per casualty from their insurance policies.
Let me get this straight. The courts forced them to pay the family $75 for a human life, but they collected $445 for that same life from their insurance. They literally turned a profit of nearly $65,000 off the disaster that incinerated their employees.
Yes, they made a staggering profit on the deaths of their workers. And to further demonstrate the sheer lack of consequence or remorse, in the summer of 1913, just 2 years after the Triangle Fire Max Blank was arrested again.
For what?
For locking a factory door during working hours at his brand-new garment facility.
You have got to be kidding me.
I wish I were. A building inspector caught him. He was taken to court, found guilty, and the judge handed down the absolute minimum fine allowed by law, $20. The judge even apologized to Blank for the inconvenience.
$20. It is just staggering. It proves undeniably that the legal system at the time simply was not designed to protect the working class. The courts functioned exactly as they were built to function, protecting capital.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the justice system failed the victims entirely.
But human grief and rage of that magnitude, compressed across hundreds of thousands of immigrants in the Lower East Side, cannot just evaporate. It has to go somewhere. And because the courtroom offered a locked door, that rage spilled out into the streets, into the union halls, and eventually all the way up to the State House in Albany, sparking a massive revolution in labor organization and workplace safety.
The reaction from the labor unions and socialist organizers was immediate, visceral, and furious. They realized that waiting for the courts or the factory owners to develop a conscience was suicidal.
Right.
On April 1911, a massive memorial meeting was held at the Metropolitan Opera House. It was a tense, mixed crowd packed with wealthy, middle-class progressive reformers in the orchestra seats and grieving, furious members of the Women's Trade Union League up in the galleries.
And that's where Rose Schneiderman spoke, right?
Yes, Rose Schneiderman, a prominent, fiery socialist and union activist who herself had worked in the garment factories, stood up at the podium and delivered a speech that completely shifted the paradigm.
Her words are incredibly powerful. They cut right through the performative grief of the wealthy attendees. She told the crowd, "I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. We have tried you, good people of the public, and we have found you wanting. This is not the first time girls have been burned alive in the city. Every week I must learn of the untimely death of one of my sister workers. Every year, thousands of us are maimed. The life of men and women is so cheap and property is so sacred. There are so many of us for one job it matters little if 146 of us are burned to death. Too much blood has been spilled. I know from my experience it is up to the working people to save themselves. The only way they can save themselves is by a strong working-class movement."
She was articulating a profound militant shift. The Triangle Fire proved with horrific clarity that relying on the benevolence of factory owners or the weak legal frameworks of the Gilded Age was a literal death sentence.
They had to fight for themselves.
Exactly. The working class realized they had to organize, and they had to do it aggressively with strikes and collective bargaining. This tragedy directly spurred the massive, explosive growth of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, or ILGWU. Women who had previously been terrified of being blacklisted or beaten by police for striking suddenly realized they had nothing left to lose.
They joined in droves.
They did, transforming the union into one of the most powerful political forces in the country.
But the outrage didn't just fuel the unions on the streets. It finally forcibly bridged the gap to political action. The progressive reformers knew they needed legislation. In New York City, a committee on public safety was formed. And the person heading it up is a name history buffs will definitely recognize, Frances Perkins.
Oh, Frances Perkins is a monumental figure in American history. She was a sociologist and a workers' rights advocate.
She was actually at the fire, wasn't she?
She was. On the day of the Triangle Fire, she had been having tea at a townhouse near Washington Square. She heard the engines, ran to the scene, and physically watched the girls jumping from the ledges. That horrific sight radicalized her approach to government intervention. She dedicated the rest of her life to labor reform.
And she went on to do huge things.
Huge things. 22 years later, President Franklin D. Roosevelt would appoint her as the United States Secretary of Labor. She became the very first woman to hold a cabinet position, and she was the primary architect to the New Deal, including Social Security and the Fair Labor Standards Act.
Wow.
And it all traces back to what she witnessed on the pavement of Washington Place.
Perkins and the Committee on Public Safety knew they couldn't just write angry letters. They needed to change the laws in Albany. They started heavily lobbying the state legislature. This intense pressure led to the creation of the Factory Investigating Commission by the New York State Legislature. Now, here is where the mechanics of New York politics get genuinely fascinating.
Yes, the political alliance here is wild.
The commission was chaired by Robert Wagner, the Democratic Majority Leader of the State Senate, and co-chaired by Al Smith, the Majority Leader of the Assembly. What is wild about this dynamic is that Wagner and Smith were absolute dyed-in-the-wool Tammany Hall politicians.
It is a bizarre, seemingly contradictory alliance. Tammany Hall was the infamous, heavily corrupt Democratic political machine that essentially ran New York politics through patronage, bribery, and ward boss control.
So you had these highly educated, middle-class, progressive reformers, often derisively called do-gooders or goo-goos by the tough political establishment, suddenly teaming up with the cigar-chomping, corrupt machine politicians of Tammany Hall.
Right.
Why would a corrupt political machine suddenly care about workplace safety? Didn't they usually protect the wealthy factory owners who paid them kickbacks?
Usually, yes. But the head of Tammany Hall, the boss, was a man named Charles F. Murphy. Murphy was, above all things, a ruthless pragmatist. He looked at the massive crowds marching in the streets. He saw hundreds of thousands of furious Jewish and Italian immigrants, people who historically voted for Tammany ward bosses in exchange for neighborhood favors.
He saw the writing on the wall.
Exactly. Murphy realized a profound political truth. Dead workers don't vote. But angry, radicalized immigrant families who blame the politicians for their daughters' deaths, they vote you out of power.
So it was just self-preservation.
Purely. Murphy realized the incredible political goodwill and voting power to be gained by pivoting the machine to champion the downtrodden working class. The machine realized that keeping the immigrant workforce alive and improving their conditions kept Tammany Hall in power.
So, purely out of political survival and opportunism, the corrupt machine throws its massive weight behind the reformers. And because Tammany Hall knew how to wield power effectively, the Factory Investigating Commission wasn't just a toothless committee holding polite hearings.
No, they did incredibly thorough, aggressive work. They held widely publicized, dramatic investigations all over the state, from New York City up to Buffalo. They interviewed 222 witnesses. They took over 3,500 pages of sworn testimony.
And they didn't just stay in the courtroom, right?
Right. They didn't just sit there. They hired field agents, including Frances Perkins herself, to do unannounced, on-site inspections of factories. Al Smith and Robert Wagner physically walked through hundreds of factories. They crawled down rusted fire escapes. They stood in unventilated rooms choked with chemical fumes. They saw children losing fingers in unguarded machinery.
They saw it all firsthand.
Their findings were horrifying, exposing the fact that the Triangle conditions were not an anomaly, but the absolute industry standard. But crucially, this commission led to tangible, aggressive legislative results. The commission's work directly resulted in 38 new labor laws passed in New York State between 1911 and 1913.
Let's talk about the specific engineering behind those laws, because they are the foundation of our modern world.
We're talking about strict, non-negotiable mandates. Laws requiring outward swinging doors so a crush of panicked bodies wouldn't seal a door shut. The invention and mandatory installation of panic bars, those horizontal push bars on exit doors.
Which are everywhere now.
Everywhere. Strict mandates for clearly marked, illuminated exit signs. Stringent requirements for internal fireproof stairwells. The mandatory availability of fire extinguishers on every floor. The installation of integrated alarm systems. And, crucially, the mandate for automatic sprinkler systems in high-occupancy commercial buildings.
They also passed laws fundamentally altering the treatment of workers. They mandated better ventilation, proper eating, and toilet facilities, and finally, they legally limited the number of hours that women and children could be forced to work in a week.
They essentially outlawed the 52-hour sweatshop grind.
Within 2 years, 60 of the 64 new laws recommended by the Commission were signed into legislation. It completely transformed New York overnight into one of the most progressive states in the country for labor reform.
And that legislative shockwave had a massive national ripple effect. In October of 1911, just months after the fire, the American Society of Safety Professionals was founded in New York. The next year, the first Cooperative Safety Congress took place, which eventually led to the establishment of the National Council for Industrial Safety, known today as the National Safety Council.
The entire modern infrastructure of occupational safety, the very concept that a government must actively regulate workplace hazards, was born directly from the ashes of the Ash Building.
Absolutely.
I want you to take a moment and just look around the room you are in right now. If you are listening to this at work, look up at the illuminated red exit signs above the doors. Look at the push bars on the emergency stairwells that guarantee no manager can ever lock you inside.
Look up at the sprinklers mounted on the ceiling.
Exactly. Look at the posted OSHA compliance notices in your break room. Every single one of those everyday safety features, things we interact with daily and take completely for granted, are written in the blood of the 146 Triangle workers. They died a horrific death so that your workplace wouldn't become a death trap.
It is a sobering, heavy realization. The laws enacted because of their deaths changed the future, undoubtedly protecting millions of lives over the next century. But there is another crucial, emotional aspect to this history.
What's that?
Well, we've talked about the macro-level changes, the laws, the unions, the political machines. But what about the memory of the specific individuals who died? The young immigrant women whose lives and futures were cut so brutally short. How do we ensure they aren't just reduced to a statistic in a labor history textbook?
That is where the incredible century-long effort of memorialization comes in. Because keeping their memory alive isn't just about reading a bronze plaque, it is an active, ongoing, fiercely protective effort. The legacy of the Triangle Fire is being physically and emotionally woven into the everyday fabric of New York City.
A major driving force behind this modern effort is remember the Triangle Fire Coalition, which was formed in 2008? It is a really remarkable alliance. It consists of over 200 different organizations, labor unions, arts organizations, human rights groups, university faculties, and most importantly, the descendants and families of the victims.
And they came together originally for the 2011 anniversary, right?
They did. They came together originally to coordinate a massive citywide centennial commemoration in 2011. But their ultimate driving goal was to establish a permanent public art memorial at the site of the fire.
The coalition actually grew out of a deeply moving, grassroots public art project called Chalk. A filmmaker and artist named Ruth Sergel started it back in 2004. The mechanics of the Chalk project are beautiful in their simplicity and their emotional weight. Every year on March 25th, the anniversary of the fire, volunteer artists, teachers, and union members spread out across the boroughs of New York City.
Yeah, they take a list of the victims' names and addresses, and they walk to the former tenement buildings where those young women used to live before they went to work that Saturday.
And right there, on the modern sidewalk in front of those apartment buildings, they write the victim's name, their age, and the cause of death in thick, bright chalk, often drawing a flower or a simple triangle next to it.
It is a brilliant way to decentralize the grief.
It really is. Instead of asking people to come to a monument, it brings the history to the neighborhoods. It reminds the modern residents of the Lower East Side or Brooklyn or the Bronx that these girls lived in these very buildings, they walked these exact streets, they shopped at these corner stores.
And because it is chalk, it washes away with the rain, meaning the community has to actively return every single year to rewrite the names, making the act of remembering a continuous physical effort.
For the centennial anniversary in 2011, the commemoration efforts were massive. Thousands of people, organized by the coalition, marched through the streets of Greenwich Village. They held aloft 146 shirtwaist kites, essentially long poles with white women's blouses attached, each bearing a sash with the name of a victim floating above the crowd like ghosts.
And at exactly 4:45 p.m., the exact moment the first passerby pulled the fire alarm 100 years earlier, hundreds of bells rang out simultaneously across the nation. Churches, university clock towers, and firehouses coordinated this massive acoustic memorial.
But the coalition didn't want to stop at annual events. They wanted something permanent. They wanted to alter the physical building itself. And after years of fundraising and navigating the complexities of altering a historic landmark, they finally succeeded.
They absolutely did. In late 2023, with the final additions completed in 2024, a permanent, stunning memorial was officially unveiled on the facade of the Brown Building itself, the exact site of the fire.
The architectural designers Richard Joan Yu and Yuri Wegman won a highly competitive international design competition for it. And their design is both architecturally spare and incredibly emotionally powerful.
Let's break down the mechanics of the design because the symbolism is deeply intentional. The memorial features textured stainless steel ribbons. There is a vertical ribbon that attaches to the corner of the building, starting high up at the window ledge of the 9th floor, the epicenter of the tragedy. And it descends straight down the stone facade, splitting into two strands as it reaches the 3rd floor.
And those ribbons have a specific meaning, right?
Yes. These steel ribbons are designed to directly evoke the traditional black mourning ribbons that immigrant communities used to drape over the front doors and facades of their tenement buildings when someone in the family died. It marks the building itself as a site of profound grief.
Then those vertical ribbons connect to a horizontal ribbon that wraps around the corner of the building, positioned about 12 feet above street level. And this horizontal ribbon is where the true humanity of the victims is permanently etched into the city. The names and the ages of all 146 victims are literally stenciled into the metal. But they aren't engraved or painted. They are cut completely through the steel ribbon as empty space.
And because they are cut out, the architects installed a dark reflective panel along the lower edge of the ribbon. When you, as a visitor, walk up to the memorial on Washington Place, you stand underneath this ribbon, you look up into the reflective panel, and you read the names reflected back at you.
But because the letters are empty space in the steel above, you are literally looking through their names and seeing the sky, or the reflection of the city, through them.
It is a brilliant architectural choice that forces the viewer to look upward, mirroring the way the crowds in 1911 looked up in horror at those same windows.
And the memorial pays very close, respectful attention to the specific cultural identities of the victims. The reflective panel also contains text quotes from eyewitnesses, fragments of survivor testimonies, and historical context. But it isn't just written in English. The text is presented in English, Italian, and Yiddish.
Furthermore, for the married women who died in the fire, the memorial deliberately lists both their birth names and their married names.
That is a vital detail. It emphasizes their family connections. It shows they had histories, lineages, and identities long before they became victims of industrial negligence.
This raises an important question regarding how we interact with the past. How does physical public art change our relationship with history? When you include Yiddish and Italian on a plaque in the middle of an upscale modern university campus, when you carve their specific ethnic names into the steel of the very building where they were trapped, you are actively rehumanizing the victims.
You are returning their identities.
You are returning to them the distinct, rich cultural identities that the factory owners deliberately tried to exploit, commodify, and ultimately erase. You are forcing the modern world to slow down, look up, and acknowledge exactly who paid the ultimate price for unregulated industrial capitalism.
It takes the event out of the abstract realm of history books and anchors it in physical reality. It says, Kate Leone, 14 years old, was here. She existed, she mattered, and we refuse to forget her. As we bring this expensive deep dive to a close, it is vital to summarize exactly why this event is an absolute cornerstone for anyone studying American social reform movements.
The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is the ultimate tragic intersection of multiple major societal currents colliding all at once. It is a story about immigration and the deeply vulnerable status of new arrivals seeking the American dream but finding exploitation instead.
It's a story about women's rights, too.
Absolutely. Considering the workforce was overwhelmingly young, female, and politically disenfranchised, they couldn't even vote for the politicians they needed to protect them. It is a glaring, undeniable indictment of unchecked corporate greed and the lethal dangers of unregulated industrialization.
But from the ashes of that horror came the birth of modern, militant, organized labor. The fire forced the government, which had been dragging its feet for decades, to finally step in and declare that human life must be legally valued over property and profit margins. The legacy of those workers is OSHA. It's the concept of mandatory fire drills, its minimum wage laws, child labor laws, workers' compensation, and the very existence of the weekend.
And as you think about the sheer scale of all of this, the next time you are forced to participate in an annoying fire drill at work, or you grumble about safety compliance training, remember that you are participating in the direct, hard-won legacy of those 146 workers. Their sacrifice built the invisible safety nest that we all rely on today.
I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought. During the intense legislative investigations after the fire, New York City's fire chief, a man named John Kenlin, was called to testify before the commission. He stated on the official record that his department had actively identified more than 200 other garment factories in New York City alone that had the exact same deadly conditions as the Triangle factory. 200 buildings, just as dangerous, full of locked doors, oil-soaked floors, and highly flammable materials.
Think about the massive implications of that single statistic. The Triangle fire happened at 4:40 p.m. on a Saturday. It happened in broad daylight, right in the heart of a bustling neighborhood.
Everyone saw it.
Thousands of middle-class and upper-class New Yorkers stood on the streets, horrified and helplessly captivated, physically watching the bodies fall. It was an unavoidable, visceral public spectacle. But what if the spark from that cigarette had ignited in the scrap bin at 2 a.m. instead?
What if it had been a factory running a covert night shift?
If the fire had happened in the dead of night, those young girls would have jumped in the dark. They would have fallen unseen by the public. The flames would have been extinguished, the bodies would have been quietly carted away to Misery Lane before dawn, and the city would have woken up to a brief headline on page 4 of the newspaper, rather than a trauma violently burned into their own eyes.
If the tragedy hadn't been a massive public spectacle, if the comfortable public hadn't been physically forced to stand on the sidewalk and watch the gruesome, undeniable consequences of their cheap clothing and the owner's cheap labor, would Tammany Hall ever have flipped?
Would the labor laws have ever actually changed? Or does true justice only happen when society is violently forced to look at the bodies?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take care of yourself, and we will see you next time.